Hi, and welcome to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast, where I always have a special guest on to tell us a little bit about their life, their amazing life story. I'm delighted to welcome Mark Gillingham this morning. How are you, mate? You okay?
I'm good. I'm good, thank you, mate. How are you?
Very good. I just want to thank Kevin Lane for putting us in touch. Kevin, of course, has been on this show more than once, and delighted to see he's a free man for Christmas, which is well deserved, and hope he has a great Christmas. Thanks to him for putting us in touch. Neil, let's go right back to the start then. Where were you born? Where were you brought up?
Yeah, so ultimately I was born in the East Midlands. I'm from Northamptonshire originally. I grew up in the Eastern District of Northampton, and I'm an only child. So I have a mum, dad, quite a well-known family, but we're relatively insular, to be completely frank with you.
Okay, I mean, I obviously read your background. I mean, not the happiest of childhoods, it has to be said.
No, my childhood was unique, I'd say, compared to most. So most people will be familiar with my grandfather, Russell Causley. Russell was the first person to ever be convicted of murder twice with no body, on purely circumstantial evidence in legal history, and a title, unfortunately, that he's had ever since. So in terms of my childhood, as I say, I was born in 1989, which makes me 32 this year. And in terms of my background, ultimately, my grandfather faked his death in £1 million life insurance fraud. So he threw himself over a yacht. He was his solicitor, his mistress, and another party decided to take a yacht over to Guernsey from the south coast. Whilst they were over there, they went for dinner. They got back onto the yacht, or so they claimed to. They took a journey into the middle of the English Channel, and his mistress decided to make a mayday call. That's really where our journey started. It transpired my grandfather wasn't actually dead. He decided to take a hydrofoil back across to mainland UK. He was living as a woman in Brighton at the time. And so he spent 3 months missing. And that's what really provoked in terms of them, the police getting in touch with my mum, because obviously my grandfather was presumed dead, missing at sea. And my mum said, well, hang on a second, I haven't seen my own mother for 8 odd years now. She's been missing. And that's when our story then started to unravel.
I mean, it's a fascinating story, this, and it has so many different, lines of inquiry, I guess the police would call it. How did that story progress, Neil?
Yeah, so obviously, when my grandfather decided to throw himself off the yacht, Dorset police at the time, got in contact with us. They turned up at our door one morning and said, are you Samantha Gillingham? Spoke to my mum. And my mum confirmed who she was and said, in a state of panic, I need to find my mum. I haven't seen her for 8 years. Where is she? Because the ultimately where it came about was that Patricia, who was my grandfather's mistress, was saying that she was the wife of Russell to the police. And that obviously wasn't very, very true. So they then started looking at making lines of inquiry, and it was very evident, ultimately, it was quite clear to anybody that my grandmother had literally been picked up and she'd vanished. There was no sign of her. There was no passport. There was no, the last person she'd seen was her doctor and her solicitor, both of whom she informed that she was going to be divorcing my grandfather, Russell. And what ultimately transpired was that there was a plan between my grandfather and his mistress to murder the lady you can see on your screens now. And there was multiple stories that came out. But ultimately, when my grandfather was convicted of the life insurance fraud, he was in prison. And how it all then started to really unravel was that he'd said to multiple different prisoners, it could be a lot worse, I could be here for murder. They went to the authorities, to the Screws. They spoke to the Screws and said, look, this guy that you've padded me up with, he's a complete nutter. He's been talking about, weighing in his missus. There was multiple theories in terms of how it was quite a gruesome murder at the time, because obviously there was an absence of a body, but there was multiple theories that my grandfather had provided, whether it be, he fed her to pigs, he'd dissolved her in acid, put her down a mine shaft and dismembered the body. There was all sorts of very, very grisly accounts that my grandfather had given to these people. And ultimately, when my grandfather was released, he was gate arrested for the murder. He was put on trial in 1996, similar time to when Kevin was hitting his headlines, with his story. Very different cases, may I add. Kevin's a huge miscarriage of justice, but there is no doubting that my grandfather is certainly, probably one of the most evil killers that I've certainly ever stumbled across in my life in the justice system. But I think that, in terms of Russell, he went to trial in 1996. He was convicted unanimously of murder at Winchester Crown Court. It was a landmark case because, there was no evidence, absolutely no evidence whatsoever. And the protracted delay as well, I think that's what made it even more unique as well, from the moment she went disappeared, that she disappeared, my grandmother disappeared in 1985, to this story coming out, in 1996. That's a huge amount of time to obviously to go. So I think that, in terms of the conviction, it was significant. I would have been 6 years of age at that point. And anybody will tell you, right, as a parent, is that the first 7-8 years of any child's life is probably the key moments where they develop, where they learn, where they gain their basic survival skills, right, and in their interpersonal skills, it's going to set them up for the rest of their life. So it was a very traumatic time. I was dealing with very adult issues at quite a young age, to be completely honest with you. And from 96, when my grandfather was convicted, up until 1998, there was appeal after appeal. There was a period where we went then quite quiet, and then in 2003, most people will be aware, but there was changes ultimately to legislation which enabled the prosecutors, CPS, to be able to prosecute someone twice for the same crime without it being a malicious prosecution, or considered as a malicious prosecution. So my grandfather was then prosecuted for he went to the High Courts in 2003, won his appeal, had his conviction overturned. He was now a free man. I was 13 years of age at this point, right? So I was quite young, and by 14 we were embarking on our second conviction. So this time it was at Exeter Crown Court. My grandfather was obviously had been held up until that point in HMP. He was now released on court bail. And that point, I was 14 years of age, and we were put under police protection. There was various protections. All of our phone calls were recorded. I used to have to carry around a panic alarm at all times, which was linked to the control room. Yeah, it was scary. It was a daunting period, right? And I was withdrawn from education. And that's when then sort of the story really kicks in terms of myself and the impacts that these crimes have on families, right?
I just want to go back to that case. I mean, I was trying to think of cases that I've studied, and obviously, I've written a lot of books on the Cray twins. Two significant murders, involved in that whole Cray story. The disappearance of Jack the Hat McVitie, presumed dead, body never found. Cray twins convicted on evidence, given by others. But then the disappearance of Frank Mitchell after getting him out of prison, subsequently never seen again. No conviction, that case thrown out. So why, what was the compelling evidence that convicted your grandfather?
Yeah, so in the first case, ultimately, I think that, it was partly in terms of my grandfather was a con man and con woman, okay? So my grandparent, look, I'm not going to sit here and say my grandmother was whiter than white, okay? She was a lovely lady. They were your epitome of your middle class English people, right? But at the same time, beneath the surface, there was a sinister side to our family. Okay, I've got to be very honest with you. There was a deceitful side. My grandparents made money ultimately from committing high-level fraud. Both my grandfather had been in prison at 18 for GBH and for robbing his own parents' post office. He was a ruthless man, right? He still is. And in terms of my grandmother, she left school. She was working in a factory, and she met my grandfather when she was 15. So the story, obviously goes some way back. My grandfather was known for his domestic violence. My mum had been put into a child's home at 2. My grandfather had ultimately broken her arm. There was 2 dogs that were brutally kicked to death. One was chopped up with an axe because it had soiled the floor. And the other one, a similar story, my grandfather had kicked it to death. And as the story goes, It looked like a pillow had been shredded. So when we look in terms of my grandfather was someone in Germany. There was an account of my grandfather pulling out a gun on someone out of a glove box, and a former colleague of his. There was more to the story that met the eye. So when my grandfather then, and there was the money side of things as well. My grandmother was going to take him for half of everything. But, you know, if you ever watched Catch Me If You Can, they were Catch Me If You Can figures. They blagged their way into the aviation industry ultimately. They were quite high up in the aviation industry. I still have copies of the original drafts of Concorde upstairs, for instance, in my little boy's room. They were high level. They were earning £1,000 a piece back, you know, a week in the 70s and 80s, comfortably, all across the globe, traveling all across the globe. So the deceit was there. And ultimately, I think when it came to his confessions, my grandfather was a very capable man. He was someone that, you know, that was very, very capable. So it wasn't beyond the realms of feasibility. And I think that, you know, in terms of his wife, if it had been an absolute stranger, do I think that they would have secured a conviction? No, I don't. But I think because of the amount of ultimately motivation that was there, and the level of deceit, and, you know, his mistress, you know, openly pretending to be Carol in Canada. She went over and worked in the same company that my grandmother had worked for, in exactly the same office, and was kicked out of Canada by the Royal Mounted Police for using Carol's green card. So when you started pulling all of the threads together in terms of the lifestyle that they were living, you know, Patricia had literally moved into the family home. To this day, she still wears my grandmother's Rolex, still lives in a house funded by my grandmother's estate. And when you start, you know, pulling all those threads together, is that it put a very compelling case as to why wouldn't he have killed her, and where is she, and who else would have? Because my grandmother didn't have enemies. My grandparents didn't have enemies. They weren't involved in crime where they were, you know, involved in, you know, gangs or organised crime in that sense. They were very much lone soldiers that committed high-level fraud and lived a very, very lavish lifestyle off the back of that. So I think that when, you know, the first conviction, no doubt, anybody will tell you, is that, you know, when you get Kevin Lane's probably a good person for this, right? Is that when you have people that are involved in the corruption side of things, and jailhouse snitches, and people having secret conversations with police and that sort of thing. And that's what ultimately was happening with the first conviction. So when it came to 2003, what had transpired was one of the prisoners that had given evidence against my grandfather in the first trial had been asked by the prosecution whether or not he had ever given evidence in a similar trial in the past at all. And he answered no. And the defence in 2003 went back through a number of case files and found that he had given evidence in a court of law in a very, very similar set of circumstances, where a wife had been murdered and a husband had been convicted. And he had given evidence in that trial back in the 1960s, and that came out in then 2003. And on that basis alone, that technicality, that undermined, obviously, the trials. So the CCRC that was referred to at the time said, you know what, this conviction's unsafe, and we need to put it back before a court, and that's why it was overturned. What convicted my grandfather on the second time was his sister. My grandfather's sister, Carol, and this is out in the public, people can go and have a look at this, the type in the case. But ultimately, she had overheard a conversation between Russell and his mistress, Patricia, where he had said, I've already got rid of one wife, don't make me get rid of another. That was pretty crucial evidence, really, and that's what convicted him.
Fascinating. I mean, we've talked a little bit at the start about your childhood. It was traumatic for you because not only did you have a father who was addicted to heroin and crack cocaine, but you witnessed a lot of domestic abuse at such a young age.
Yeah, look, you know, it's unfortunate, right? But the trauma has to manifest itself in some way. And I think it'd be unfair to say that my mum was the only one that suffered. I think we all suffered. The ripple effect is huge from crime. I really struggle watching some podcasts where people glamorise crime, glamorise drug use, glamorise the lifestyle. I've been a rich man, I've been a poor man. These days I'm somewhere in between. But, you know, in terms of the lifestyle, was that my lifestyle and the lifestyle that my son has now, and the stability, it's all about stability, right, and love. I didn't have much of that growing up. Certainly had love, you know, I love my parents, they're still in my life. Love my mum dearly. Try and find a picture where I'm not stood in front of her, behind her, or by the side of her, you know, being honest through all of this. Love my father dearly. You know, I do. I love my parents. We make mistakes as human, you know, as humans. And what I learned was, you know, life's not a destination; it's a journey, right? And you meander through life. But yeah, it was hard. You know, there was a lot of domestic violence, a lot of anger. The addiction was rife, and the lifestyle that, you know, surrounds dealing and drug addiction. The trauma, you know, my mum has obviously been in prison. That's not a secret. My father's been in prison. I've been in trouble, you know, myself. And so now I'm trying to tell my story, right, and at the same time I'm trying to break the cycle of trauma.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to do, and you know, I'm sure that you'll do well. You're very well read, clearly. You know, listening to you speak, you're somebody who, you know, is easy to talk to, and I think you'll go a long way with that. Let's fast forward back to where you took us a little bit earlier, and that is 14, when you were pulled out of education. What was that like?
Oh, it was horrific. You know, look, I've got to give some context in terms of what had happened at 14. So, you know, I had, you know, we're hitting national news regularly because of obviously the high profile. It was a landmark case, you know, it really was. In today's, if my grandfather's conviction had happened now, you know, you see these big crimes, right, that, you know, that hit headlines for months upon months. That was what was happening. You know, you can trace back in terms of the articles that was, you know, the exposure was huge. It was really, really big. And unfortunately, children, you know, they can say the wickedest of things, right? And they don't quite understand in terms of the gravity of what I was trying to process as a teen, a confused teenager myself who was incredibly lost. I needed a big hug, to be honest with you. So I was attacked by 16 people. Ultimately, there was a police officer who was a parent governor at the school. There'd been a situation at my family address where ultimately the police had been in attendance. Because of the high profile nature of our family, when the police attend our residence, we don't have 1 or 2 patrol cars. We typically shut down roads. And the police had turned up in quite an abundance. There had been a domestic incident at my family home. And one of the police officers that had turned up was a parent governor. And obviously, because of his role, he was privy to a lot of information that normally people wouldn't be privy to in that given situation and scenario. And he decided to leak some of that information. So I was sat in a maths lesson at the time. I was 14 years of age. The kid was sat next to me, and he made a flippant comment with regards to domestic violence and drug addiction in the house and the murder. I asked him where he had gained that source of intelligence from. And when I asked him, he looked me in the eye and said, "My father." So I said, "Right, I'll be honest, I got up, walked out. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do with myself." And I went to my head of year and I said to him, "My head of year, this is what he's just said to me." He said to me, "Right, okay then." So he pulled the son in and he spoke to him. He said, "What did you say to Neil?" So he repeated what he had said with regards to my father and my grandfather. And what had happened is that when he'd confirmed everything, they'd called in the police, because obviously it was a police matter. They'd called in our head teacher at the time, Mr. Stanley, and they sat in a room. And my parents asked what had been said between the pupil and my head of year, Mr. Vandersteen. And Mr. Vandersteen confirmed that the source of information had come from the boy's father. So when the chief of police and what have you came in and they sat down, they asked exactly the same question. And he denied it. He said that I was a liar. I wasn't a liar. I've never lied in my life. So anyway, the police couldn't guarantee my safety anymore. I'd been the children that had attacked me. The attack was so ferocious that the witnesses themselves had said they had been physically sick. I was one kick away from having a brain hemorrhage. I was taken to hospital. Eventually, I was discharged. And the police couldn't guarantee my safety. And at the same time, most people don't have a gang of bullies, along with national press, private investigators, and then a murderous grandfather who wrote a book about having you kidnapped and murdered by a paedophile ring as a child to deal with. And at that point, the police said, enough's enough. We can't have him in this school anymore. And the school wasn't willing to have me in their school either. So I was left to it. I was pulled out. I had a tutor. My parents, my father took some time off of work. He was working. Might be being an addict before that, but he's always worked. Always good luck to my parents. Both my parents, very hard-working people. And my dad decided to teach me for a bit, and then I went to college. I went to college for a year. Studied equine. I've always liked horses. They're very spiritual animals, very calm, and that's good for your nature. So I used to enjoy going down to the stables and looking after the horses and what have you. And then I realised that actually I didn't want to earn 250. I realised how hard they have to work, right? Being a stable hand on a yard, and they were earning like 200 quid a week. I thought, I don't know if I want to do that. That's not going to fund my lifestyle. And so at 15, I started working for my parents. My parents had 2 companies at the time, so I started working for them. And we've done quite well out of the businesses, to be completely honest with you. But then I got to 17, the bullying continued, being completely honest. But it escalated, became a lot worse. Some knives pulled on me, baseball bats. I had a gun pulled on me at one point, a few years later after that. But it was quite bad, to be honest with you. And it came to a head. And I won't go into that one on this talk, Steve, because that's a bit of a different, that's quite a long-winded story in itself, to be honest with you. But ultimately, someone was quite seriously injured. Someone was quite seriously injured. Someone had their legs broken. Another lad had his jaw broken. And I'd had enough. I'd become quite an angry young man, suffering from mental health. And I was really struggling to articulate myself. Not yet necessarily. I was a boy who needed direction, needed guidance, needed a male role model figure. Being honest with you, whilst I love my father, I think my father would admit that he hasn't been the best of dads. You need a man to teach you how to be one. And so, with that, I soon found myself on remand at 17. Well, just turned 18. I was in HMP Woodhill. And Glenparva, done Glenparva as well. That was an interesting place. Never been in trouble before, never been arrested before, and I was automatically thrown into these places. And it was sink or swim, right? Well, I've never sunk so far in my life, and I don't intend to at this stage. So that was really where things changed. And I went to trial, and when I was released, I was on remand. When I came out, there'll be a picture, I would imagine Steve will throw up in a minute, of me stood outside the House of Lords. And I was 18 in that picture. That one, that's the one. So I was 18, turning 19 in that picture. That's me outside the House of Lords. And that's where I then became involved in the offender management side of things. I realised that the system was broken. And it was letting down. It didn't matter if you were a victim, a perpetrator, it was letting you down, or a taxpayer. And so I became involved with a program called the Chrysalis Program. We launched 2 offender management programs. It's now gone across quite a few different prison estates, but ultimately it started off in HMP Reading and HMP Highdown. And we wanted to break, ultimately, that cycle of offending. We wanted to break we're turning more, our justice system's turning into more of an American penal system rather than somewhere where people can actually go and get help and support. I wasn't a criminal. I was a lost young man who was angry and resentful. And that's what caused me to go off the rails, right? And I'd imagine other people as well, is that they end up in the criminal justice system through no fault of their own whatsoever. It's situational. I could have quite easily been a drug dealer. I've got the intelligence to run a county line if I wanted to, okay? But we have options, we have choices. And I was quite fortunate that people came into my life who picked me up, and they grabbed me, and they twisted my ear, and they pulled me in the right direction. So we started with the Chrysalis program when I was 18, 19. And, I was in the House of Lords talking with, various MPs and what have you, and government ministers in terms of the criminal justice system and where I believed it was failing. And then by, 22, I was involved in a car accident, in a car crash.
Well, before we come to that, let's just go back to that imprisonment, because again, it's another traumatic experience that you've been through, which, especially at such a young age. And I mean, I visit Woodhill. I visit Charles Salvador there when obviously during COVID we haven't been able to visit as would normally do. But that prison is it's one of the the biggest prisons. Yeah, and I mean, what was it like for you just going in for the first time? Were you nervous?
Yeah, look, I was shitting myself. I'm not gonna lie to you, right?
You can't sugarcoat it, I guess.
Yeah, I was 18. I'd grown up. Look, by 14, I was running around with a kosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had enough of getting. When I say I used to get battered, Steve, okay, I used to get battered.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, every day, not by my parents, okay, by other children, bullies bigger than me. I'm not a big guy. I've got a heart of a lion. Kevin will tell you that. Anybody that knows me will tell you that. Okay, I'm not a big guy, and they used to batter me. They would block off. There was one entrance and one exit to the playground. Okay, and for years they'd block off one and they'd block off the other, and they would then take it in turns. They'd pull me into the middle of the playground. They'd take it in turns. My shoes would come off. My socks would come off. My trousers would come off. They'd batter me. I used to cry myself to sleep every night. Now, when you've been at your lowest at 14, okay, and you've been through 2 murder trials by the age of 14, and you've seen what I've seen, and you've grown up in the environment I've grown up in, you don't have choices. You have choice. Your choices are you either sink or you swim. And so I went in there, and I was petrified. I was absolutely petrified. They had to do a load of checks first because of my grandfather, to make sure we can cross paths. I was ultimately arrested for Section 18, Section 20, dangerous driving afraid, possession of an offensive weapon, dangerous driving, and what have you. So I was up for some quite serious charges. Anybody that gets charged for 2 Section 18s at the end of the day, you get enlifed. And I was 18, and I had my bundle, with no word of a lie, was like that. Right, that was just one bundle of just statements. I had 57 statements against me. And as anybody that's been in prison will tell you, unfortunately, especially in the YOs, it is violent. It is it's a pressure cooker of testosterone. But I wasn't someone that had a point to prove. I wasn't there because I wanted to be a hard man. I was there because I'd been attacked and I wanted to get away. And unfortunately, in the course of me getting away, someone was hurt, or people were hurt. And so I wasn't there to prove a point. And because I was quite articulate and I understood the criminal justice system quite well because of how long I'd been in there, I'll be honest, I made friends quite quickly. I knew quite a lot of people anyway. A lot of people knew who my family were. I didn't have a point to prove. I didn't walk around with a chip on my shoulder, treading on toes, because if you tread on toes, people will stamp on your feet very, very quickly. I didn't borrow. I didn't beg. I didn't steal. But as I say, because of my father and what have you, is that when people were pulling out knives, okay, he would say to me, right, well, look, you carry the tool you're prepared to do the time for. So it was a kosh. So I used to carry a kosh. So straight away, being honest with you, I didn't make a lot of people go and start melting their toothbrushes and stuff like that. I was like, sock, pool ball, I'm happy, mate. But I'll be honest, I didn't really, I remember going into Wood Hill and I walked onto the landing, and then it's the smell. That prison smell will never leave you, right? I still smell it now. The clinking of the gates and the footsteps, you know, as the screws walk along the landings. You get a lot of time to think about your life, think about what's important to you. What do you want to achieve? What's your legacy? What do you want to be remembered for? And so I'll be honest with you, prison was probably, I wasn't sad, being honest. I had a lot of reflection time. I'm not saying I didn't cry. Of course I cried. Anybody that's looking at life in prison will tell you that they cried, and if they didn't, they're a liar. So I sat there, but then I picked myself up. I remember going outside. I didn't go out on exercise for the first 2 weeks, being honest with you. I sat there in my cell, went out obviously for the shower and stuff like that, and you know, play a game of pool. But I didn't go outside. And when I went outside, they've obviously got the helicopter, you know, stop the ladders and what have you coming down. I looked up at the fences. I was only out there for 5 minutes, and I went, boss, I'll go back in. I just found it really depressing. I just looked up at the walls, and like I was on this small in a cage exercise yard. I just looked up, and I was just like, oh my God. I looked at the wires going across. I said, boss, what's that for? He said, helicopters. I just thought, you're in a different place. You're out of your depth. And I'll be honest, I was out of my depth. I was a lost little boy. And but 6 months later, I studied my case, and I went through with a fine-tooth comb, and there was CCTV evidence. There was covert surveillance at the end of the day on the people that I was alleged to have attacked. They were under surveillance for quite some time. I've got an email to prove that if anybody wants to see it. And what had transpired is that when it went raised to go to trial, is that the officer one of the officers had sent to his SIO, to the senior investigating officer, and said there appears to be covert surveillance that collaborates Gillingham's story. And they had a choice, right? But we don't want anybody to know about this, is what they said. That's how the email signed off. And when it came to then the trial, they had a choice. Either you release the video evidence, CCTV evidence, and the jury make an informed decision in terms of whether or not this individual is guilty of what's been alleged, or you don't. And they didn't want to, did they? So they left the charges either on file or they dismissed them. And I pled guilty to dangerous driving, which I did. My driving was dangerous, I'll admit that. And I walked out of court, and that's how I ended up in the House of Lords. So that was my first experience of prison. I went back again, once again for another dangerous driving. I had a car crash this time. But yeah, to answer your question, Steve, it was daunting.
Yeah,
it was scary, mate. But you know,
I can only imagine. I've been in as a visitor, Neil. You know, and I've been in many. I visited the Crays in prison in numerous places over 10 years. I visited Ronnie Crane, Broadmoor over 10 times. I visited the Sayers brothers in numerous prisons in the last 15 years. So prison is something that I'm used to as a visitor, but it's a completely different experience going in as somebody who maybe has been convicted of something, or even someone on remand. So it's always interesting to hear, you know, your reflection on that.
I think remand's harder. I think remand's harder because you haven't got an end date. Yeah, it's like when you're sentenced, right? You've got your Rottle Day or whatever it is, you know. But when it comes to remand, is that you've got all of the perks. Like you can have as many visits as you want. You can wear your own clothes, irrespective of, you know, if you're standard, basic, or enhanced. But you know, ultimately, you don't know when you're going home. So it could be as quick as a hat, right? All of my mates were at the time, they were laughing, saying, well, "You're definitely going to get found guilty," and all this. And so they were quite amazed when they called me later on that night, and I wasn't there. And they said, "Where are you?" I said, "Well, as quick as, you know, your situation, as bleak as it looks, right, it can change very quickly." So, but I just found it very, very, I found it a time of reflection. I look back at some of the letters. I'm writing my book at the moment, and I'm picking a name, and I'm going through and I'm recounting some of the stories. And there's been some funny moments. You know, I learned a lot, right? I've had some funny times, and I had some really, really low times. There were suicides, obviously. That's always hard when there's ever a prison death. The guy above me in Wood Hill, he committed suicide. That was horrible. I listened to that. And there's certain things that you'll see and you'll witness that will never leave you. Anybody that's been to prison will tell you that. Whether it be koshes, whether it be oil, whether it be shanks. And the screws can be just as bad as well, to be honest with you. I've seen people go purple because of screws.
More trauma though, Neil, and it's something which is a thread through your life, and the fact that you're still here and capable, and I see at times it upsets you, the fact that you're here prepared to tell your story, which ultimately will help others, is a major step forward. Let's go to the car crash that you mentioned earlier. You were kind enough to send us a photograph of it. It brings back a flashback to me in a lot of ways, because I was involved in a horrific accident going to see Ronnie Cray in Broadmoor, where we were involved in an 80-mile-an-hour crash. I've been involved in it as a passenger, and the car flipped 3 times and ended up on the other side of a central reservation. Luckily, it was just outside Leeds, a place called Micklefield. I just remember it being slow motion and thanking the heavens that it was 7:15 in the morning and there was no traffic coming the other way. It was a drink driver who caused our accident. He'd come down, hit the central reservation. There was smoke in front of us. As the smoke cleared and we were doing 80 mile an hour, an articulated lorry, which was half a mile in front of us, was suddenly right in front of us. We clipped the back of it. We spun 3 times, went over the central reservation. We landed on the roof. I just remember slow motion, the windscreen going, shattering. And literally I walked out with a click in the suit that I was wearing, going down to see Ronnie Cray. My mate, who was the driver, who was an experienced driver, kept his hands tightly on the wheel at the top and just didn't let anything get out of control as best he could, and obviously hit the brake. He came out with a little scratch on his finger. We were lucky lads that day. That was one of my lives used up. Tell us about your car crash.
Yeah, so one of my mentors was a guy called Jeff. He's not in my life anymore, but big up Jeff if you ever listen to this, mate. And I'd been over to his house. I picked up some industrial dehumidifiers. That's why I was driving a van. And usually I'd be driving a BMW. And I'd taken the van because of these. Jeff had said to me, look, is there any chance you can pick up these dehumidifiers? They're my old man's, ultimately, okay? So Dad chucked me the keys to the van. He said to me, do me a favour, don't crash it. It was the last thing he said to me, famous last words, right? So I've gone over to Jeff's, been over there, had a barbecue. I was seeing a girl that lived on Jeff's road at the time. So she was going to come over and stay over mine that night. And pretty much we left. And 5 minutes later, I was driving along. And the next thing I know, I'm coming to a brow of a hill and we've just had a head-on collision. And I can't really remember much more than that. And I woke up. What I can remember was waking up. And I woke up in ICU. It's quite a funny story, really, but it isn't, and it is. I woke up in ICU. And there was this guy looking over me. I was in the crash room at the time. And I was hooked up to all these machines and what have you. And I said, ain't my time yet, mate. I jumped out of bed, Steve. I'll kid you not, okay? I jumped out of bed. I've ripped the white. I've got no clothes on because they've all been cut off, obviously, right? And I ran through ICU. And you've got ICU there, you've got A&E, and then you've got the car park. And I've run through ICU, through A&E. And as I got into the car park, I just collapsed. I got, obviously, carted back into hospital, right? I was pissing blood for weeks. Broke all my ribs. There was no airbags in that, believe it or not. But apparently I kicked my way out of it. I actually got myself out of the van. And I'd got the other girl out of the van. I had a girl with me at the time. She was uninjured, broke a nail, similar to what you were describing. Literally broke one nail, right? I'd taken the full brunt. We'd hit into a Jeep Cherokee. There was very limited road markings, being honest with you, so it was very difficult to dictate speed. The road had just been resurfaced. There was no lines on the road. It was a brow of a hill on a unclassified, undulating. I'm using their words now. Undulating road, right? And and like I remember waking up in hospital, right? So after my ICU thing, I've then obviously been taken back to a ward. I've been heavily sedated because I had serious head trauma, and I was becoming quite aggressive, being honest with you. I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't fathom my set of circumstances and why all these people were saying that I need to stay there. In my head, I was absolutely fine. I was more pissed off that they'd cut off my the clothes I was wearing, because they were brand new designer clothes, right? And I couldn't believe it. I remember saying to the woman, I was like, "Where are they? Where are all my clothes?" Right? And when I woke up, there was police there. It was really weird set of circumstances. I was in prison with a guy called Slater, right? And his old man was a pub landlord at a pub in town. I used to occasionally drink at with some mates. I woke up, and Slater's old man stood over me, and I said, "You all right?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "I watched you get brought in, mate." He said, "I knew you were on your own." He said, "So I wanted to stay next year." Ever such a nice guy, right? I said, "I need a cigarette." I said, "What's gone on?" He said, "The old Bill been down there. Don't worry, they're taking blood tests. Everything's all right." I said, "Well," and I was completely legal, Steve, right? So the next day, the police come in and come and see me. And the police said to me, "Look, it's an accident, mate. Accidents happen." He said, "You're lucky to be alive, you are." He said, "Have you seen the state of the vehicle you're driving?" I said, "No." And anyway, he said, "You're lucky to be alive." So I said, "Right then." Anyway, he said, "Look, it's an accident. That's it. There's no further, you were," because I was insured, legal, vehicle was completely legal, vehicle was a company van, that was completely legal. I was completely legal, no drink, no drugs, nothing, right? So there was nothing there that would make you think, "Oh God, like something untoward's about to happen," right? But insurance paid out, and we were involved in a civil dispute ultimately. Obviously, I started suing for compensation, as anybody would, because I couldn't work or anything like that. I was really, really ill, like really, really ill. And I spent weeks upon weeks in hospital or in and out of hospital. And ultimately, what then transpired is on Boxing Day, I can't remember what year it was, 2013, I believe. Yeah, 2013 Boxing Day. I was picked up by traffic police. Traffic police turned up at my house, knocked on my door. I knew because of the hat that they were wearing, right? They were wearing a white hat. So I knew it was traffic. I said, "You're right, officer." Now, I'll be honest with you, Steve. I thought someone may have called up the police for driving like a knobhead, drifting, something like that, revving, racing. I don't know, cutting someone up. I'm not gonna sit there and lie. Okay, I was 18, 19. I've always been driving BMWs. I'm a VIP now at BMW. Okay, I've always driven BMWs. I've always loved my Beamers. And I thought to myself, 19, 20-year-old lad, 21-year-old, or however old I was at this point, you're probably driving like a knobhead, and someone's reported you. And that's all I thought. And he said to me, "You didn't turn up to court." I said to him, "Sorry." He said, you had a summons. You didn't turn up to court." I said, "Oh, I haven't received a summons." And I hadn't. And he said, "So we're arresting you for failure to turn up at court." So anyway, it's Boxing Day, right? 9 o'clock at night, something like that, 8:30 at night. I said to him, "Right." So he said, "We've got to take you down to the station." They didn't handcuff me. They done a traffic stop whilst I was in the back of the car. You couldn't make it up. Anyway, we got down to the police station. They put me in custody. They said, "You're going to appear before the courts tomorrow." Well, I appeared in front of the courts. As I say, I'd never received the summons. I hadn't moved addresses or anything like that. You know, I'd stayed where I was. And I said to them, "Look, with the greatest respect," I said, "I've always turned up to court. I've never breached court bail, police bail, nothing in the past." I said, "And I was on a lot more serious offences than what dangerous driving would be, right?" So I said to him, "Why would I turn up to all those court hearings, but I wouldn't turn up to this one? I never received your summons." Well, anyway, cut a long story short, the other guy that I'd hit into was a serving police officer. So I've got to be careful. And his wife was a serving police officer as well, still is. And it just so miraculously happens that 6 months after the accident, I couldn't remember anything, which is why my account even now is so short to you in terms of the run-up and what happens. I can't remember anything. I can remember what happened in hospital, but I can't remember the accident. So my statement was relatively short, right? But it just so happens that he 6 months later, he had a recollection of events and resubmitted a new statement to the police to say that I had swerved onto his side of the road. There was no side of the road. There was no white line. But nonetheless, I couldn't lie. I've said to you, I'm not a liar. And I couldn't do anything about it. So I had Rob Rinder as my barrister, who we now see on our TV screens, right? It's Judge Rinder. Good old Rob. So Rob came down. He was at Two Head Court practicing. He was prosecuting for the British government against the Turks and Caicos Islands. So I hired him. And Rob came and worked his magic, right? And so I ended up with a 10-month sentence and a 2-year driving ban. So then once again, I was back into the system. I couldn't believe it. I paid my own legal fees and everything. You know, I thought to myself, no one else was hurt. The insurance had paid out. It's completely legal. I didn't quite understand. What made a mockery of it is they sent me to an open prison. And part of my job was I was on a farm as a tractor driver. So, look, you can't make it up. So I spent 5 months in custody, right? I had my shit shower and shave. I broke my ankle jumping over a ditch chasing a bloody sheep. And so I spent 2 months in cast. And I got out, and I shouldn't have been there, Steve, okay? In any shape or form. Look, what rehabilitation was there, right? I went there, okay? I sat in an open prison, okay? I twiddled my thumbs. I paid my own legal bills. I came out with 32 grand's worth of debt because I couldn't work the year prior to that because of obviously my injuries. But because of how legal aid works, they base it on your earnings for the prior year. So I'd earned too much. So they said, well, he's earned too much, didn't qualify. So I ended up paying for my own legal fees. So I didn't quite understand in terms of what was the punishment. I'd already had the punishment in the sense that I was seriously injured and I was completely legal, but it was what it was. And I learned from it. But 2 weeks after, I said to my parents, I said, look, I'm going to South Africa. And they said, you're not moving to South Africa. We love you too much. I love South Africa, but I had some friends over there that owned some estate agency firms, and they'd offered me a job. I wanted a new start, but like I said, my parents didn't want me in South Africa, so they said, well, we'll let you go down to London. Go down to London, go and find your way in London. So I moved down to London. That's what I did. I was setting up marquees at the time. I was getting paid £50 a day. I was taking 1 day's work would give me enough to be able to pay for my train ticket down to London to job interview. So I'd book a day of interviews. I'd go down there. I'd start at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd finish whatever time I had to finish. I'd do a day of interviews. I'd done that for a couple of weeks and I landed a job, managed to black my way into an international firm. I was the only person internationally who didn't have a degree, let alone GCSEs, because I don't have them either, really. And it went from there, really. And I started working, and it was very much meritocratic organisation. So it was reward based on merit. You could earn as much as you wanted, depending on how much hard work you put in, right? And that's what I did. And I ended up working in this international consulting firm, working with I still do, some of the biggest international firms and household names that you would know. Most of my clients, my smallest client's 12 billion, my largest client's 64 billion in revenue, to give you an understanding. So I became quite well known in that niche area of consultancy, and I've done okay out of it. But in the background, my grandfather had obviously became eligible for parole in 2012. So he was sentenced for 16 years, which was backdated even at his second trial, his second conviction. It was backdated again to 1996. So I was on borrowed time, right? And it's like anything, is that if you don't understand it, find someone that does understand it and get them to teach it to you. And so I was, I watched my mum, okay, suffer throughout her whole life. All right. And I always said to her, I'll never allow you to suffer when I become older. I was a little boy. I couldn't protect her. But as a man, I can, which is what I've done. And I said to her, Mum, we're not taking this rolling over. I said, we're fighting. We'll fight, and we'll take whoever we have to go and fight, we'll take it to their front door. And that's where you'll see a picture of me stood outside 10 Downing Street. Okay. So 2014, I started campaigning for changes in the criminal justice system. I ended up embarking on quite a mad project with, and people can watch The Investigator, British Crime Story. I've got 2 programs now on Netflix. So I've got The Investigator, British Crime Story, we're series 1. That went global, 190 countries. That was a co-production with Psycho and also ITV. So Simon Cowell and what have you, we worked with him for 2.5 years. He was the executive producer. We then made When Missing Turns to Murder, Nightmare in Suburbia, Killing the Truth. The Killer in My Family literally just came out in September. So that's quite cool on Discovery Plus. So we've been really, really vocal. And then off of the back of that, Helen's Law, obviously, I joined ranks with Marie McCourt, who's a very, very inspirational lady. who's been through a hell of a journey herself. Her daughter, Helen, was murdered by Ian Sims back in 1988, I believe, off the top of my head. And like us, she's never had closure. And so we started campaigning for No Body, No Parole. And we had over 1 million signatures from the public. The public were amazing. They really did support us. It ended up becoming law, albeit in a different format to what I would have liked. You know, whilst we campaigned for No Body, No Parole, ultimately, the Human Rights Act doesn't allow for that. So what was spun off and what people often see in the media is actually known as Chapter 9, internal guidance of the Parole Board Members Handbook. And that's been in place and in practice since 2016. So it's nothing new, even though it's been spun off as something new. It's actually something which has been put into practice since 2016. The CEO of the Parole Board, Martin Jones, ultimately confirmed that as well, Joshua Rosenberg. And if people have a look at it, they'll see that I'm incredibly vocal in terms of the accuracy of the wording of that. But I think my journey doesn't stop, Steve. And, you know, that's how I cross paths, obviously, with Kevin. I believe in fair justice. Fair justice means that if you do something wrong, you get punished for it. And if you haven't done anything wrong, you shouldn't be punished. And that's ultimately how I believe that justice should be applied in a very, very balanced and common sense manner, right? And Kevin was, when I heard Simone, obviously I know that you spoke to Simone.
Yeah.
And when I listened to Simone's voice and her tone, she was like a wounded animal, right? And
100%. Simone, of course, is Kevin's good friend. Yeah,
and you know, she was like a wounded animal, and the tone of the conversation was the tone. The last person I heard like that was my own mum, and she said, "What do I do if I don't find my mum?" And my father gets out. I said to her, "Well, we'll fight, won't we?" And we did. We fought, and he was released. I lost the battle eventually. I did lose the battle. He was released in October of 2020, and 3 weeks ago he was recalled back to custody for breaching his license conditions. But yeah, that's how I came across Simone and how I came across obviously Kevin. And I said to Kevin, "Look, if I can use my understanding in terms of the system and my contacts and what have you to help you, then look, let's see what we can do." And I don't think there was a collective effort. There was the backing. I don't think he quite realised the backing that he had from all of us, right? And it's magical to see him now at home and cracking on with his life and cracking on with his family life. And it's good to see my grandfather back where he belongs, behind bars, because in my eyes, he's still a monster who can't be trusted. And I don't know if, you know, who would want him living next door to them.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen so many cases like that over the last few years as well. I mean, the more recent one was the lottery winner, the lottery rapist who came out and moved into Newcastle. You know, he
Who's
actually
that? Colin Pitchfork.
No, Colin Pitchfork's obviously the more recent one that we all know.
Okay.
I mean, you know, Charlie Salvador was very outspoken about the fact that he'd been given parole. Yet Charlie's, remains in prison. But
big shout out to Charlie, though, Steve. Okay, in all seriousness, a lot of so you know, like the calls for greater transparency in the parole process, for instance. A lot of that was put on to War Boys. You know, John Warboys, the black cab rapist, right?
Yeah.
So the campaign has obviously kicked off, okay, but a lot of the changes that are happening in the parole process, especially in terms of transparency, are off the back of Charlie, not off the back of War Boys, because obviously Charlie, you know, we're hoping that, you know, at some point, I do hope that he gets released. You know, Charlie should be put somewhere. I've read all of his books, all of Charlie's books. I was obviously in Woodhill at the same time that he was on obviously Unit 6, as far as I remember. But in terms of, you know, he should be released. He never killed anybody. And then you've got monsters like my grandfather that are being released despite playing wicked games. You know, my grandfather. So to put it into numbers context, right? My grandfather became eligible in 2012 for parole. in 2014, we had never engaged with my grandfather prior to this, right? And in 2014, my grandfather writes, this is just a crazy, mad story. People need to go and watch The Investigator, a British crime story. But ultimately, in 2014, what ended up happening was my grandfather wrote a 6-page confessional letter. And that 6-page confessional letter was quite gory. It's on my Twitter. People can go and have a look at it if they want and read. And but it detailed how my grandfather had burnt my grandmother for a period of 3 days in the family home. Okay, and for 2 years, my grandfather maintained that. So we had another 2 parole hearings. Okay, in that time, he was using the parole board ultimately as a platform to be able to attack my mum and I legally. Okay, and what he'd done was he had wrote this confession letter, and I knew it existed, and I called up my solicitor, Hodgell Wooding. If anybody ever needs a good criminal solicitor, call up Hodgell Wooding. And I called up Hodge and I said, Hodge, what do I need to do? And he said to me, look, Neil, he said, I've got to be honest with you. He said, you're not going to get the letter. And he said, and it was a bit of a throwaway comment on his part, but he said to me, the choice is, okay, is that you either break into the office, which ain't going to happen, or you find a bent copper. Well, I found myself a bent copper. That's what I did. And so I ended up having the 6-page confessional letter leaked to me, okay, and I was getting quite a lot of content leaked from inside prison to me, which is how the Investigator was commissioned. Now, my grandfather maintained that account for 2 years, and if anybody goes and watches the Investigator, they'll see that we even burn a pig, okay, to prove that you can burn a body. We all know that you can anyway, but we wanted to prove same weight, same consistency, blah blah blah. Well, anyway. The police were saying at the time, you didn't do it to my grandfather. You couldn't have disposed of the body in the way that you're saying you have. And my grandfather said, look, I know what I saw and I know what I did. Okay, I burnt that body for a period of 3 days and there was nothing left. All right. Now, he maintained that for a couple of years. And then one day he suddenly turned around and went, I lied. I buried her in a beautiful and idyllic location. And I'm not going to tell you. Right. So if it wasn't bad enough that for the last 2 years, I've been researching in terms of burning of bodies, and I don't know how many corpses people have seen, but I've seen quite a few, okay, in a relatively short period of time. And at the same time, worked full time and being a father, okay, bought a house, run a company, so on and so forth. You know, all the normal things that people expect of you in society when you've got this like devil in the background really fucking beating you. And you're sat there and you're thinking to yourself, you know what? I'm trying to keep it on the straight and narrow, guys. I'm trying to keep it on the straight and narrow, but no support. And at the same time, you've got the parole board that are allowing this killer to attack my family, right? So he maintained that account, and he said, you know, I buried in a beautiful and idyllic location. He maintained that for a few months, and then he said to the parole board, I didn't do that. I didn't do it. I've never committed murder. I'm innocent. And so we're like, head fuck. All right. And then he turns around 2 years later and says to the parole board, actually, go back to my first ever confession. I did burn her for 3 days, but I wasn't the killer. That was my mistress. And they release him. Wow. And that's my journey of the parole process in the last 8 years. And they released him. And do you know what made it worse? Is that they could have only put him in 3 safe houses, right? I won't say the area because I don't think it's fair, but they could have only put him in three safe houses. Okay, we went to one of the safe houses. Okay, well, we went to all 3. We went to the safe house that he was at. 70 yards from his safe house, from his little hostel, okay, of sex offenders and arsonists, right? Opposite was a girls' school, and 70 yards to the right was a toddler playground, and they were putting that animal and animals like him. And then they wonder why people like me have got a problem. And at the same time, okay, Steve, is that before they released my grandfather, my mother and I had 3 police visits, okay, unofficial, where they met us in a car park to say that threats to kill had been logged against our name, no further action, not to worry, but just as a heads up, don't step out of line. 3 times they logged threats to kill against us, okay? Who's the complainant? My grandfather's probation officer. I've never met them. Apparently they can recognise me because they've seen me on TV. Their words, not mine. It was hearsay evidence. But 3 times I said to them, charge me. put me in a court of law. If I've actually done something wrong, put me in a court of law. And do you know what their bone of contention was when they brought me in for a voluntary interview? Right, and Hodgel turned up with me. We went in. It cost me $1,000, right, for this voluntary interview. There's no price to liberty in my eyes. Okay, I wasn't using their duty solicitors. And they when I turned up, and they said, "Yeah, the complainant is this woman who I've never met." And I said to them, "Well, I've never met my grandfather." I said, "He's still in prison." "Yeah, I know, but you could be planning on killing him." But he hasn't even got a release date. And they kept him in H&P Little Hay. And if anybody knows what H&P Little Hay is, it's a sex offenders prison. He was there for 7-8 years in a sex offenders prison as a murderer. His index offence conviction is murder. Why was he kept in a sex offenders prison for 8 years? When he had wrote a book about having me kidnapped and murdered by a paedophile ring. And the blonde-haired, blue-eyed little boy that I now have is my son. It was me. Obviously, I've darkened. I've lost a little bit of hair. But it's now my little boy. And so that's the sort of pressure and the sort of antics and the sort of tactics that these guys employ, right? And I said to them at the time, I said, I've done everything the right way in terms of my grandfather. Even when they released him, I didn't go near him. I sent press there. But it's been hard, really hard, and the trauma doesn't stop. I've been diagnosed with CPTSD, which is a complex form of post-traumatic stress disorder, for those that don't know. And I'm going through CBT therapy. I've been in therapy now for 6 months. This could probably last another 6 months or so. See how we get on. We'll have to have a diagnosis potentially for autism. I think I'm autistic. But they're labels. I've had labels throughout my life. Killer grandson. You know, whatever it may be, right? And for me, as you said earlier, is that my story is quite complex. It's quite long. I think everybody's story is complex and quite long, but mine's very nuanced from a very, very young age. I'm not even halfway through my life. If we have a conversation in 30 years' time, I don't know where I'll be, being honest with you. We'll go one or two ways, why not? But
well, I'll tell you what, Neil, it's an inspirational story. I'm delighted that you have shared it with me. And the clock has beaten us because, you know, I don't like to string these interviews out too long. But I think you've condensed it. I think you've articulated it superbly. I think people will certainly follow your story with interest. Where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, it's the best place is Twitter all the time. So Justice and the number 4 Carol with an E. So Justice for Carol. Pretty vocal on Twitter. I'm always open to speaking to people. I'm like a really open and friendly person. I don't care what your background is. You could be, I really don't care where you are in life. If you think or feel that I can help you, then reach out. Time is finite, you know, and I can't help everybody, but if I can help someone who is in a situation similarly to myself, whether it be contacts, advice, experience, I don't know, reach out, get in contact, share, talk to me, right? But I think, like, you know, for you, Steve, thank you so much, genuinely. And thank you for giving my my grandmother a platform. It's still for my grandmother. She's been missing 37 years next June. 37 years. That's mad. You know, I'm 32 years of age. Got to put it into numbers.
I'd like to dedicate this program to your grandmother, and I just want to commend you on everything that you've done, as I say. And this has been a fascinating interview. Once again, thank you to Kevin Lane for setting it up. Neil, hope you and your wonderful family have a great Christmas, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, watching your progress, and maybe getting you back on the show at some point. Take care, Neil.
Steve. Take care. Merry Christmas to you and all your viewers. Thank you.
God bless me.
God bless. Bye-bye.